The clause was on page 7, buried in the equity structure section. The kind of language that looks like standard legal formatting until someone who knows what they are reading points at it and says, "Read this carefully." My lawyer said it without drama. Just placed his finger on the paragraph and looked at me. I read it once, then again, then a third time, and somewhere in that third, reading the full picture assembled itself. Victor wasn't investing in my company. He was acquiring it, slowly, across 2 funding rounds. Structured so that by the end of the second, I would own a minority stake in something I had built from nothing. Technically still present, practically an employee in my own business. The offer that had looked perfect 48 hours earlier looked completely different now. Not because the numbers had changed, because I finally understood what the numbers were actually doing. I closed the document, thanked my lawyer, drove home, and spent the evening thinking about exactly what I was going to say to Victor in the morning. But to understand why that conversation mattered so much, you need to know what I had built before he came along. I started the business in my spare bedroom, not as a romantic origin story, just as a fact about where things begin when you have an idea worth pursuing and no external capital to pursue it with. A desk, a laptop, a specific problem I had identified through years of working in the industry for other people, and the particular clarity that comes from understanding a problem well enough to know exactly what the solution needs to look like. I had spent 8 years working for companies in my field before I started my own. Not wasted years, formative ones, each role teaching me something different about how the industry worked, where the inefficiencies were, where the real value was being created versus where it was being performed, where the gap existed between what clients actually needed and what the existing players were consistently delivering. That gap was where my business was born, not from inspiration, from observation, from 8 years of watching the same problem go unsolved by organizations too large or too comfortable to approach it differently. I left my last position on a Friday afternoon, started working on the business the following Monday morning. No fanfare, no announcement, just the transition from working within someone else's structure to building my own. The first year was the year of foundations. Product development, testing, refining, the particular iterative process of building something that has to work in the real world rather than just in the controlled environment of your own thinking. I made mistakes, some of them costly in time, if not in money. Rebuilt sections that weren't strong enough. Changed directions when the evidence pointed clearly that I had the angle wrong. And gradually, through the accumulation of that process, something real began to take shape. My first client came through a former colleague who had watched me work for 3 years and trusted what I was capable of. Not a large client, but a real one. Someone who was paying for actual value rather than doing me a favor. That distinction mattered enormously. The second client came from the first. A referral. The specific kind that happens when someone has genuinely good experience and tells someone else about it without being asked. That is the only validation that means anything in the early stage of a business. Not self-promotion, not polished marketing. Someone who received real value telling someone else that the value is real. By the end of the second year, I had 7 clients. A product that worked. A growing reputation within a specific segment of the industry. And a very clear picture of what the next stage of growth required. Capital. Not because the business was failing, because it was succeeding in a way that had outgrown what I could bootstrap alone. The opportunities in front of me required resource I didn't have. Hiring the right people. Building the infrastructure for a client base significantly larger than the current one. Investing in the product development that would take it from good to genuinely exceptional. All of it required money I didn't have and couldn't generate quickly enough from current revenue alone. I had thought carefully about investment before any of this became urgent. Not just whether to seek it. What kind? From whom? On what terms? Because capital comes with conditions. Always. And the conditions are sometimes more significant than the capital itself. I had seen enough of the industry to understand what happens when founders take investment without reading what the investment actually requires. The gradual loss of decision-making authority. The shift from building something for yourself to building something for someone else who happened to have more money. The particular trajectory that ends with the person who had the original idea watching someone else steer it somewhere they never intended it to go. I did not intend for that to happen to me, so I was careful, or I thought I was. I had a lawyer I trusted, someone who understood investment agreements, who I had already decided would review anything before I signed it regardless of how good it looked on the surface. That decision turned out to be the most important one I made before Victor entered the picture. Not because I anticipated what was coming, just because I understood in the abstract that things are not always what they appear to be, and that a second set of expert eyes on something important is never a waste of time. Victor reached out in the autumn of my third year, when the business was at exactly the point where the right investment would change everything. The timing felt fortunate. It was not an accident. Victor's reputation preceded him in the specific way that reputations do in contained industries. You hear the name before you meet the person, attached to things, to companies that had grown significantly under his involvement, to founders who spoke about him with the kind of respect that suggests genuine value added rather than just capital deployed. He had a portfolio of 8 companies across adjacent spaces, a network that extended into the kind of rooms where significant decisions get made. The sort of investor whose association with your business signals something to other people in the market. That context mattered to me, not because I was impressed by reputation for its own sake, but because capital without network is worth less than capital with it. And Victor represented both. His initial message was brief, professional, said he had been watching the space, that my company had come up in conversations more than once, that he would be interested in a conversation if I was open to one. I was open to one. We met for the first time at his office, the particular kind of office that communicates success without trying too hard, not ostentatious, just quietly substantial, the kind of space that has been assembled by someone with taste and enough resource to act on it. Victor himself matched the environment. Mid-50s, unhurried manner, the specific quality of someone who has been in enough rooms to know he doesn't need to perform confidence because the real thing is already visible. He asked about the business with what felt like genuine curiosity, not the surface questions of someone going through a due diligence checklist. Specific questions about the product architecture, about why I had approached the client problem the way I had, about where I thought the market was going, and whether my current trajectory was pointed at where it would be in 3 years rather than where it was now. Those questions told me he had done his research before the meeting, that he was not approaching this cold, that the interest was informed rather than speculative. I found that encouraging. We talked for 2 hours. The conversation moved across the business, the market, my background as portfolio. Comfortable in the way that conversations are comfortable when both people are talking about something they understand well. He asked sharp questions and received honest answers, and the exchange had the particular energy of 2 people who are finding out if they can work together. By the end of the first meeting, I was genuinely interested. Not dazzled. Interested. There's a difference. Dazzled is what happens when you want something badly enough to stop thinking clearly. Interested is what happens when the evidence so far genuinely supports further engagement. The evidence so far genuinely supported it. We met twice more over the following 3 weeks, each meeting building on the previous one, moving from general interest towards specific possibility. Victor brought one of his associates to the second meeting, someone who handled the operational side of his portfolio involvement, who asked more detailed questions about the business model and the financial structure. I answered everything directly. I had nothing to hide, and I don't believe in being evasive in these conversations. If an investor is going to put significant capital into your business, they need accurate information to make that decision. Providing anything less is both dishonest and counterproductive. The third meeting was where the offer began to take shape. Victor laid out the broad terms. Investment amount, equity stake being discussed, timeline, what the capital would be used for. The numbers looked good, more than good. The investment was substantial enough to genuinely accelerate the growth trajectory. The equity stake being proposed was significant, but not alarming on its face. The kind of dilution that founders accept in exchange for capital that changes what's possible. Victor talked about it with the easy fluency of someone who has structured many of these conversations, framing the investment as partnership, using language that positioned us as aligned parties working toward a shared goal. It all felt right, the way something feels right when you want it to be right, and when you haven't yet looked at what the want is preventing you from seeing. He said his team would prepare the formal documentation, that I should review it with whomever I wanted, that he was confident we would find the term straightforward. That word, straightforward. I noted it, filed it, and 4 days later when the document arrived in my inbox, I sent it directly to my lawyer without reading it first, because that had always been the plan. Read it with someone who would see what I might miss. My lawyer called me the following afternoon, said there were a few things worth discussing. His tone was neutral, but neutral in the careful way that means something specific is coming. I went in the following morning, sat down across from him, and he opened the document to page 7. My lawyer's name was Mr. Okafor. He had been practicing corporate law for over 20 years. The kind of experience that expresses itself not in dramatic declarations, but in the specific quality of how he moved through a document. Precise, unhurried, with the particular focus of someone who knows that what matters is rarely on the surface. He opened the agreement to page 7, placed his finger on the equity structure clause, and said, "Read this carefully. Not this is a problem. Not Victor is trying to cheat you. Just read this carefully." So I did. The clause described the equity arrangement across 2 funding rounds. The first round was the one we had been discussing. The numbers were as Victor had presented them verbally. My stake after round 1 would be diluted, but I would retain a clear majority. Controlling interest. Everything still pointed in my direction. That was what you saw if you read the first round in isolation, which is how it had been presented across 3 meetings. As a standalone conversation, as if the first round was the complete picture. But the clause didn't end there. It described the second round, a follow-on investment that the agreement anticipated and structured in advance, with terms already embedded in this document before the second round had even been discussed, terms that determined how equity would be allocated when that round happened. I read those terms once, then again, then a third time, because the first 2 readings produced a conclusion I wanted to verify before I accepted it. The third reading confirmed it. After the second round, at the participation levels the agreement anticipated and essentially required, my stake would fall below 50%. Not dramatically, not in a way that looked like a cliff edge in the numbers. Gradually, through the natural mechanics of the structure, Victor's combined stake across both rounds would give him effective control. Not majority ownership necessarily on paper, but the specific combination of equity percentage and the voting rights structured into the agreement would mean that the significant decisions about the company were no longer mine to make alone. I would need his agreement, his sign-off, his approval, for the things that mattered most. I put the document down, looked at Mr. Okafor. He was watching me with the patient expression of someone who has already processed this and is waiting for the other person to catch up. I asked him to walk me through it. He did, slowly, clause by clause, explaining not just what each element said, but what it meant practically. What would look like 18 months from now if I signed this document and the business continued growing the way it was growing. The picture he assembled was clear. The investment would provide the capital I needed. The business would grow as a result. And as it grew, as the second round became necessary and the terms of this agreement kicked in, I would find myself running a company I had founded, but no longer controlled, making decisions within parameters set by someone else, needing permission for the moves that mattered, technically still present, functionally displaced. Mr. Okafor said one more thing that completed the picture. He mentioned a company in Victor's existing portfolio, one I knew by name, operating in an adjacent space to mine. He asked if I knew it. I said I did. He said the overlap between that company's current positioning and the direction my business was heading was notable. I sat with that for a moment, and then the full shape of it became visible. Victor didn't just want to invest in my company. He wanted to acquire it, cleanly, affordably. While I believed I was entering a partnership, the plan, as best as I can now read it, was to fund my growth, use my growth to increase the value of what he was acquiring, then use the second round mechanics to take control of something worth significantly more than what the initial investment had cost him. At which point my company and his existing portfolio company would have an obvious conversation, with Victor holding the deciding vote in both rooms. I was not going to be a partner in this deal. I was going to be the mechanism through which Victor acquired something at a fraction of its actual value, dressed in the language of investment, structured in the language of partnership, but designed from the beginning with a completely different outcome in mind. I closed the document, thanked Mr. Okafor, paid for the consultation, drove home, and spent the evening thinking, not emotionally, clearly, about what I had almost signed, about the 3 meetings where none of this had been visible on the surface, about the fluent professional language Victor had used to frame everything, about how close I had come to believing the framing entirely, and about what I was going to say when I called him in the morning. I called Victor the following morning, early enough to signal that I had been thinking about this, not so early that it looked like I hadn't slept. He picked up with the same easy manner he brought to everything. Warm, unhurried, the particular tone of someone who considers a situation settled and is simply moving through the remaining formalities. I told him I had reviewed the agreement with my lawyer. He said good, said he hoped everything looked straightforward. That word again. I told him most of it did, that there was one area I wanted to discuss before we move forward. The equity structure across both funding rounds. A brief pause. Brief enough that someone not paying attention would have missed it. I was paying attention. He said, of course. Said he was happy to talk through any questions. Said the structure was fairly standard for this kind of investment. I told him I understood that, and that I wanted to propose some amendments before we proceeded. I laid out the changes clearly. The second round terms needed to be restructured. The voting rights arrangement needed to be revised. My controlling stake needed to be protected through both rounds, not just the first. I was not asking for anything unreasonable. I was asking for the deal to reflect what had been presented verbally across 3 meetings. A partnership, not an acquisition structured as a partnership. I made each point simply and specifically, without accusation, without suggesting I knew what the original structure had been designed to do. Just proposing the terms that would make the agreement reflect the language Victor had used to describe it. The response was not what the previous 3 meetings had prepared me for. The warmth didn't disappear all at once. It dissolved, gradually but visibly, like watching a surface temperature drop in real time. He said the structure was designed to protect both parties, that it was standard in deals of this size, that my lawyer may have misread some of the mechanics. I told him my lawyer understood the mechanics clearly, and that the amendments I was proposing were straightforward. His tone shifted again, less worn now, more precise. He said the terms had been structured carefully for a reason, that significant amendments would require him to reconsider the deal entirely, that the investment was predicated on a specific framework, that changing the framework changed the nature of what he was offering. I noted the distance between this conversation and the 3 that had preceded it. In those meetings, he had spoken about alignment, about shared vision, about building something together. Now the language was about frameworks and structures and what the investment was predicated on. The vocabulary of someone protecting a position rather than advancing a partnership. I said I understood, that I wanted to make sure we were both clear on what the proposed amendments were before any final decisions were made. I sent him a written summary of the changes that afternoon. Specific. Clean. One page. Each amendment described simply with a brief explanation of what addressed. Mr. Okafor had helped me draft it. The language was professional and precise. Nothing aggressive. Nothing accusatory. Just the terms that would make the agreement mean what Victor had said it meant across 3 meetings. His response came 48 hours later, via his associate rather than directly. The associate said Victor had reviewed the proposed amendments, that he appreciated my diligence, that unfortunately the amendments as proposed were not workable within the structure of the investment, that Victor remained interested in the business, but that the terms as originally drafted were the terms he was in a position to offer, that if I wanted to proceed, it would need to be on the original basis. I read that response once. Then I sent a brief reply. I thanked Victor for his time and interest across our conversations. I said the terms as originally drafted were not ones I was in a position to accept, and I wish him well with his portfolio. That was the entirety of it. No lengthy explanation. No expression of what I now understood about the original structure. No public statement of any kind. Just a clean professional exit. I put the phone down and sat for a moment in the specific quiet of a decision made and completed. Not triumphant, not relieved exactly, just clear. The way you feel when you have looked at something honestly and acted on what you saw, without letting what you wanted it to be override what it actually was. Victor had assumed the capital was the variable that would make me sign, that the need for investment was strong enough to make the terms secondary, that a founder at my stage of growth would look at the numbers and stop reading before they got to page 7. He had assumed incorrectly, and now I needed to find what I should have had from the beginning. Capital that came without a hidden second agenda, from people who wanted a return on an investment, not control of something they hadn't built. I gave myself 1 week before actively pursuing alternative investment, not because I needed the time to recover from anything, but because the right decisions about capital require clear thinking. And clear thinking benefits from a short period of deliberate stillness after something significant has just happened. I used that week to do 2 things. Revisit what the business actually needed from investment, and define precisely what terms I was and wasn't willing to accept. Not in a reactive way, not defined by what Victor had tried to do, defined by what the business required and what I needed to remain in control of what I had built. That process produced a specific document. Not long. 2 pages. What the capital would be used for. The growth milestones it was intended to enable. The equity range I was prepared to discuss. The non-negotiable structural terms. Controlling stake protected through any subsequent rounds. Voting rights that reflected ownership accurately. No pre-structured second round terms embedded in the initial agreement. Clean and clear. I shared it with Mr. Okafor. He reviewed it, made 2 small suggestions. I incorporated both. Then I started having conversations, not with the most prominent names in the investment space, with the right ones. That distinction matters. Victor's prominence had been part of his appeal. The network, the signal his association sent to the market. Those things were real, but they had come attached to terms designed to take the business from me. What I needed was capital and genuine alignment, not prestige with a hidden cost. I spoke to 6 investors over the following 6 weeks. 2 of them were immediately unsuitable for reasons that became clear in the first conversation. One was interesting, but operating in too adjacent a space to my own market for the relationship to be straightforwardly clean. 2 were possibilities, and 2 were right. The 2 who were right were smaller than Victor. Less prominent names, less impressive offices, less of the particular social gravity that Victor had carried into every room. But their questions were different. They asked about the business in the specific way of people who wanted to understand it well enough to support it, not acquire it, not redirect it, not use it as a piece in a larger arrangement they were assembling. Just support it, help it reach what it was clearly capable of reaching, and receive a fair return on the capital they were putting in. That is all a good investor should want. And both of them wanted exactly that. Nothing more, nothing less. I shared the investment terms document with both of them early in the process. Not as a test, as information. These are the parameters within which I am having this conversation. If these don't work for you, I would rather know now. Both of them read it. Both of them came back with questions rather than objections. Questions about the reasoning behind specific terms, about how I had arrived at the equity range, about what the milestones represented in terms of the growth trajectory. Genuine engagement with the substance, not pressure to change the framework. We negotiated. Both relationships required real negotiation. I want to be honest about that. There were points of difference that took multiple conversations to resolve. Moments where I wasn't sure one of them would get there. But the negotiation throughout felt like what negotiation is supposed to feel like. Two parties with aligned interests working out the details of an arrangement that serves both of them. Not one party trying to change the fundamental nature of what was being agreed while the other one caught up. Both deals closed within 3 months of walking away from Victor. Total capital raised was somewhat less than Victor's offer had been, but it was clean, structured exactly as I had specified, controlling stake protected through any future rounds, voting rights reflecting ownership accurately. No hidden mechanics pointing toward an outcome 3 meetings hadn't mentioned. Just capital and a clear agreement about what it was for. I want to describe what the months after those deals closed felt like, because they felt different from the months before Victor had appeared. Not just because the business had more resource, because the resource was genuinely mine to direct. The decisions I made were mine. The direction I took the company in reflected my assessment of what the business needed, not a negotiation with someone who had a separate agenda for where it was heading. That freedom is not a small thing. It is the entire thing. When you have built something from a spare bedroom, based on a specific understanding of a specific problem, the ability to keep making the decisions that reflect that understanding is not a detail. It is the difference between building your vision and executing someone else's. Victor had nearly made me execute his. 2 investors I had never heard of before a phone call 3 months earlier had given me the capital to continue building mine. The business grew. The way things grow when the resource is there and the direction is clear and the person making the decisions is the right person to be making them. Client base expanded. The team grew for the first time. The product development I had been unable to fund through revenue alone began moving at a pace that changed what was possible. And somewhere in that growth, I started to understand what the company could actually become. Not what I had imagined in the spare bedroom. Something larger than that. Something that was going to have a visibility in the market that Victor had clearly anticipated, long before I had fully seen it myself. The business grew steadily over the following 2 years. Not in a way that generated public fanfare. In the way that real businesses grow when the fundamentals are right and the people directing them are making decisions based on accurate understanding rather than ego or external pressure. Client base doubled, then grew beyond that. The team expanded carefully. Each hire made because the work required it and the person was right for it. Not to look like something, to function like something. The product development that the investment had enabled produced results that changed how the market perceived the company. We moved from being a promising small player to being a name that the significant buyers in our space knew and considered seriously. That transition doesn't happen overnight. It happens through consistent delivery over enough time that the reputation becomes self-sustaining. We reached that point somewhere in the middle of the second year. I knew it had happened not because of any single event, because of the quality of the inbound conversations that started arriving without us having to initiate them. The right kind of attention from the right kind of people. Unprompted and based entirely on what the company had demonstrated it could do. Victor's portfolio company was visible throughout this period, operating in the adjacent space, moving in a direction that would have intersected cleanly with mine if the deal had gone through. I watched it without obsession, just the natural professional awareness of a significant player in your market. It had resource. It had Victor's network behind it. It had all the advantages that come from being backed by a prominent investor with deep connections. And it grew. I won't misrepresent that. It grew. But it grew in the particular way of something that is being directed toward a specific strategic purpose rather than being allowed to find its own fullest expression. The decisions it made were the decisions of a company serving a portfolio strategy, not the decisions of a company pursuing its own clearest possible vision. That distinction produces a different kind of trajectory over time, not dramatically different in the early stages. But the gap widens, and by the end of the second year, the gap was visible to anyone paying attention to the space. My company was moving faster, more fluidly, making decisions that reflected an accurate reading of where the market was going rather than where a portfolio needed it to go. The clients who mattered were noticing. I heard through the natural circulation of industry information that Victor had made several attempts to accelerate his portfolio company's growth in response to what we were doing. Some of those attempts had worked. Some had not. The overall trajectory remained respectable but not exceptional. The kind of performance that returns capital without generating the transformative outcome that Victor's positioning suggested he had been anticipating. My two smaller investors were entirely satisfied. Both of them had received the returns the investment warranted, and both of them had been genuinely useful throughout the process. Not just capital. Introductions made when they were valuable. Perspective offered when it was relevant. The kind of investor involvement that adds something real without replacing your judgment with someone else's. I had maintained strong relationships with both of them, the kind built on straightforward dealings and consistent delivery, not complicated by hidden agendas or structural mechanics designed to shift power over time. Just two people who had put capital into something that performed and were pleased with how it had gone. Victor's message arrived on a Tuesday morning, about 14 months after I had sent the brief professional reply declining his original terms. The message was well constructed. The tone had the warmth of the early meetings without any reference to what had happened between them and now. He said he'd been watching the company's progress with interest. Said the growth had been impressive. Said he had been thinking about whether there might be a conversation worth having given where things now stood. Said his perspective on the opportunity had evolved, that he would be interested in exploring something if I was open to it. I read it once, thought about it for less time than he would have expected, and replied the same afternoon. I thanked him for reaching out. Said I was glad the company's progress had been visible. Said that we were well capitalized for the current growth phase and not actively seeking additional investment. Said I wished him continued success with his portfolio. That was the entirety of my response. No lengthy explanation. No revisiting of what had happened with the original agreement. No suggestion of what I now knew about what he had been attempting. Just a clean, professional decline. Brief. Final. Without any door left open that might require a subsequent conversation to close. He replied once. Said he understood. Said the offer stood if circumstances changed. I noted the reply and moved on. I want to say something about Mr. Okafor, because this story doesn't end the way it ends without him. What he did in that office was not complicated. He read a document carefully, found a thing I had not found, pointed at it without drama, and said, "Read this carefully." 4 words. But those 4 words were the difference between a business that remained mine and one that was quietly acquired while I believed I was entering a partnership. Good legal advice is not an expense. It is infrastructure. The same kind of infrastructure as the product you build and the team you hire and the clients you serve. The part of the foundation that you only fully understand the value of when it does what it is supposed to do. It did exactly what it was supposed to do. And I have not signed anything significant since without that same careful review. Not because I became paranoid, because I learned the precise value of the thing that saved everything. I think about the version of events where I didn't send that document to Mr. Okafor, where I read it myself and found the first round terms acceptable and signed before the second round mechanics registered their full meaning. Where 6 months later, I was running a company that was growing because I was good at growing it, but growing it toward an outcome Victor had engineered before I had ever walked into his office. That version was entirely possible. It was the version Victor had designed the agreement to produce. He had built it to be signed before it was fully understood. The language was technical enough. The structure was layered enough. The framing across 3 meetings had been warm enough and specific enough to make the document feel like confirmation of what had already been agreed rather than something that required independent scrutiny. It was well constructed. I'll give him that. What it wasn't was enough, because I had made one decision before any of it started. That nothing significant gets signed without a second set of expert eyes. That one decision made everything else possible, including walking into a Tuesday morning in the second year of properly funded growth, with a company that was entirely mine, moving entirely in the direction I had chosen, serving clients who had chosen it for what it actually was, and declining a message from a man who had once tried to take it from me, politely, finally, without a single word about any of it. Sometimes the most important protection you can put in place is a decision made before you need it, that you're never too confident to get a second opinion. If this story resonated with you, the preparation of it, the importance of reading what is actually in front of you rather than what you want to be there, leave in the comments. I read every one, and the next story is already waiting for you.